A man stood in a crowded cemetery on Memorial Day, sneering as others laid flowers on a fallen soldier's grave. "What's the point? Dead men don't care," he muttered loudly, earning gasps from the crowd. He smirked, unbothered, until a cold voice behind him broke the air. "Care to repeat that?" Turning, his smirk vanished as he faced a figure in a pristine military uniform, shadowed by a presence that seemed otherworldly. What followed would change his life forever and reveal chilling truths. Alan stood at the edge of the crowded cemetery, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the rows of headstones. Memorial Day had drawn families and veterans, their faces somber as they paid respects. To Alan, the whole affair seemed pointless. "Crying over people who can't hear you," he muttered under his breath. His voice carried just loud enough to turn a few heads. An elderly woman glanced his way, pulling her grandson closer. Alan smirked, leaning against a tree, feeling smug at the ripples of discomfort he had caused. He watched as a crowd gathered near the central monument for a wreath-laying ceremony. He stayed behind, bored and unimpressed. Whistling a jaunty tune, he deliberately clashed with the quiet reverence around him. "You've got a lot of nerve," a deep voice cut through the air. Alan turned, his smirk fading. A man in a crisp military uniform stood a few steps behind him. The sunlight reflected off the medals on his chest, and his eyes, piercing and unyielding, locked onto Alan's. The man carried himself with an authority that was impossible to ignore. "And you are?" Alan asked, forcing a casual tone. "Captain Reyes," the man replied, his voice calm but firm. "And you?" "Alan," he shrugged. "Just passing through. What's it to you?" Reyes didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer, his gaze never wavering. Alan felt a strange chill in the air, as though the cemetery itself had grown quieter. "Do you know whose grave you're standing by?" Reyes asked, his tone measured. Alan glanced down at the headstone. The name Miguel Santos was etched into the marble, along with a short inscription. "A life given for others." "Never heard of him," Alan said with a shrug. "Why should I care? He's dead." Reyes's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "You think it doesn't matter because you've never had to understand the cost of sacrifice." Alan rolled his eyes. "Look, I get it. You're all about duty and honor. But not everyone buys into that. People die. That's just life." Reyes's expression hardened. "You're right. People die. But the freedoms you take for granted didn't come cheap. Men like Private Santos paid for them. You're standing here today because of them." Alan laughed, though it sounded forced. "Well, thanks for the history lesson, Captain. I'll keep that in mind." "You'll do more than that," Reyes said quietly, his words cutting like steel. "One day, you'll understand. And when you do, I hope it's not too late." Before Alan could reply, Reyes turned and walked away. For a moment, Alan stood frozen, the captain's words lingering in his mind. He shook his head and glanced again at the headstone, noticing details he had ignored before, the dates of birth and death, the brevity of the soldier's life. He turned to leave, but the cemetery felt different now, heavier, quieter, as if the air itself bore witness to the exchange. As Alan walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. That night, Alan tossed and turned, unable to shake the encounter at the cemetery. Captain Reyes's words echoed in his mind. "One day, you'll understand." It gnawed at him, though he wasn't sure why. Alan had heard plenty of lectures in his time, but something about Reyes lingered, as though the man carried a truth Alan wasn't ready to face. By midnight, he gave up on sleep and paced his dimly lit apartment. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creak of the wooden floor. He flipped through TV channels, but nothing could distract him. Then, a faint whisper made him freeze. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniably real. He turned toward the window, his heart racing. "I'm imagining things," he muttered, shaking his head. But as he glanced back into the living room, something caught his eye. A white envelope on the coffee table. He knew it hadn't been there before. Alan approached it cautiously, dread coiling in his stomach. The front of the envelope bore 2 words: "The Forgotten." Hands trembling, he ripped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper with precise handwriting. "Honor the past, or it will haunt your future. Some sacrifices demand acknowledgement." His breath caught as the room grew cold. A chill swept through, and his breath fogged in the air. The sensation of being watched prickled at his skin. Spinning around, he scanned the room, but it was empty. Or so it seemed. Then he noticed it. A faint, distorted shape in the corner. It was humanoid, but barely there, like a shimmering ripple in the air. "Who's there?" Alan demanded, his voice shaking. He clutched the letter tightly as if it could shield him. The figure didn't move, but exuded an oppressive presence that rooted him in place. "Do you think the dead are silent, Alan?" A voice echoed, soft but chilling. It seemed to come from all directions at once, vibrating through his very bones. Alan's legs felt like lead, and his instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. The figure raised a hand, or what passed for one, and pointed at the letter in his grasp. Alan glanced down, and his stomach dropped. The words had changed. The paper now read, "You've been chosen." The lights flickered, and a piercing sound filled the room. Alan dropped the letter, covering his ears as the world seemed to implode around him. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The figure was gone, leaving only silence and the letter lying on the floor. Alan hesitated before picking it up. The new words stared back at him like a challenge. "Chosen for what?" he whispered, but the room gave no answer. Deep down, he felt it. This wasn't over. Something had been set in motion, and there was no escaping it. For the first time in his life, Alan felt true fear, the kind that didn't fade but settled in his chest, a relentless reminder that his world had changed forever. The next morning, Alan woke to the sound of his phone vibrating. He hadn't remembered falling asleep, and the events of the night before felt unreal, until he spotted the crumpled letter on the floor. Reluctantly, he answered the call. "Yeah." "You okay, man?" Mark's voice carried concern. "You skipped poker last night. That's not like you." Alan rubbed his temples. "Wasn't feeling well." Mark chuckled. "Not feeling well, or avoiding losing to me again?" "I'm serious," Alan snapped. "Something weird happened." "Alan, your whole life is weird. What now?" Alan hesitated. Telling Mark about the figure in the letter would sound insane. "Forget it," he muttered. "Just a rough night." Mark sighed. "All right, poker tonight, same time?" "Yeah, sure," Alan replied, ending the call quickly. He tried to distract himself with errands, but the world felt off. Colors seemed muted, sounds distant. In the grocery store, as he reached for a loaf of bread, he heard it again, a faint whisper. "Alan!" He froze, heart pounding, but saw no one nearby. Shaking his head, he whispered, "Get a grip." But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Alan." Panic surged. He abandoned his cart and left the store, breathing heavily as he leaned against his car. The whisper was inescapable, like a shadow that followed him everywhere. Back home, Alan stared at the letter on the table. The words hadn't changed. "You've been chosen." But what did it mean? Why him? He couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was tied to something buried deep in his past. Night fell, and the unease deepened. As Alan sat on the couch, the lights flickered. The figure appeared again, more defined this time. Its shape was humanoid but translucent, its presence suffocating. "Why me?" Alan demanded, his voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't speak, but pointed to the letter. The air grew thick, and Alan felt a surge of emotions. Grief, anger, despair. Not his own, but somehow channeled through the figure. The voice from the night before echoed, softer but haunting. "You must remember." "Remember what?" Alan shouted. "I don't know what you're talking about." The figure stepped closer, and Alan stumbled back, clutching the letter. The voice whispered again, heavy with meaning. "The past will not rest." In an instant, the figure vanished, leaving the room eerily silent. Alan sank onto the couch, his mind racing. The past? What past? His life had been ordinary, untouched by tragedy, or so he thought. As he looked at the letter, something caught his eye. Turning it over, he found faint writing on the back. An address. The address stirred a vague sense of familiarity, though he couldn't place it. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. If he wanted peace, he'd have to confront it. Clutching the letter, Alan made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd visit the address. He didn't know what he'd find, but he couldn't live like this, haunted and afraid. It was time to face the unknown. The next day, Alan stood outside the address from the letter, a weathered house on the outskirts of town. The peeling paint and overgrown yard gave it an abandoned look, but something about it felt alive, watching him. He hesitated, gripping the letter tightly, then walked up the creaking steps and knocked. No answer. He tried again, harder, but the house remained silent. Frustration boiled as he tested the doorknob. It was unlocked. "Hello," Alan called, stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. The living room felt untouched, as though its occupant had left in a hurry. On the mantel, a black and white photo caught his eye. A young man in a military uniform. The name etched on the frame made his breath catch. Private Miguel Santos. "What's his picture doing here?" he whispered, unease growing. As he scanned the room, the air grew colder. A faint hum vibrated through the walls, growing louder until it morphed into distant gunfire and shouting. Alan stumbled back, clutching his head. The room blurred, and suddenly, he wasn't alone. Figures appeared, shadowy but human. Soldiers in torn uniforms moved around him, their faces grim. Among them was Miguel Santos, his expression clear and filled with determination. "Alan," a voice called, pulling his attention. It was Miguel, looking directly at him. "What is this?" Alan stammered, backing into the wall. "You need to see," Miguel said, stepping closer. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "You've ignored it for too long." "See what?" Alan demanded. Miguel extended his hand. The room dissolved into darkness, then reformed into a muddy battlefield. The air reeked of smoke and blood, explosions thundering around them. Alan dropped to his knees. "This isn't real." "It's real enough," Miguel said beside him. "This is what I lived." Alan watched in horror as young soldiers charged forward, their faces twisted in fear and resolve. Miguel barked orders, his voice steady despite the chaos. Alan tried to move, but the weight of the scene pinned him down. "Why are you showing me this?" Alan yelled over the noise. "I don't belong here." Miguel turned to him, eyes blazing. "You've forgotten, but you will remember." The ground shifted, and Alan saw fragments of the battle, Miguel pulling a wounded soldier to safety, the screams of the dying, and the silence that followed the gunfire. Alan gasped, overwhelmed. "Make it stop," he begged. Miguel knelt beside him. "It doesn't stop, Alan. Not for us. That's why you need to remember. It's the only way to set things right." The battlefield faded, replaced by the stillness of the house. Alan sat on the floor, Miguel's photo clutched in his trembling hands. The shadows were gone, but the weight of what he'd seen lingered. "Why me?" Alan whispered. "What do I have to do with this?" The house offered no answers, but deep down, Alan felt the truth creeping closer. He hadn't just stumbled into this, it was connected to him. Shaking, he placed the photo back on the mantel and turned to leave. As he stepped outside, the whispers returned, faint but insistent, urging him forward. Alan clenched his fists, more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Whatever this was, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Alan couldn't shake the images of the battlefield as he drove away from the house. Miguel's piercing gaze and the screams of war haunted him. This wasn't just about Miguel. It was about him. But why? By evening, Alan found himself parked outside his childhood home. He hadn't planned to come here, but there was someone who might have answers. His father, a Vietnam War veteran. His father rarely spoke of his service, but Alan had no one else to turn to. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. After a long pause, the door opened. His father, a wiry man with sharp eyes, frowned at him. "This is unexpected," he said gruffly. "Can I come in?" Alan asked. His father stepped aside, and Alan entered the familiar scent of old wood and tobacco. His father settled into his worn armchair, watching Alan with suspicion. "What brings you here?" Alan sat on the couch, gripping the letter in his pocket. "I need to ask about someone you might know, Miguel Santos." His father froze, his face unreadable. "Where'd you hear that name?" Alan pulled out the letter and placed it on the coffee table. "He's connected to me somehow. I need to know what you know about him." His father stared at the letter, tension etched into his face. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice low. "Miguel was in my unit in Vietnam. He saved my life, and others. He didn't make it back." Alan's pulse quickened. What happened to him? His father's jaw tightened. He was different, a leader, but more than that. He had this way of making you believe things could get better, even when they couldn't. When he died, it felt like we lost more than just a soldier, like something bigger had been taken. The words hung heavy in the air. Alan swallowed hard. "Why do you think he's reaching out to me?" His father's eyes narrowed. "Reaching out? What are you talking about?" Alan hesitated. He couldn't explain the visions or the figure without sounding insane. "I just feel like there's something unfinished." His father sighed, rubbing his temples. "If Miguel's involved, it's not about you. It's about what's left undone. If you're part of this, you've got a responsibility to see it through." The words hit Alan like a punch. He nodded, standing to leave. His father's voice softened slightly. "Miguel didn't do anything without purpose. If he's reaching out, there's a reason. You'd better figure it out." Driving home, Alan's mind raced. The whispers returned, faint but insistent. They weren't words, but they carried urgency. When he reached his apartment, the letter was waiting on the coffee table, as if it had never left. The words seemed darker, more commanding. "The past will not rest." Alan clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. Whatever Miguel wanted, Alan would uncover it. He had no choice. The following morning, Alan woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The letter on the coffee table still read, "The past will not rest." Miguel's connection to his father haunted him, but it also gave him clarity. Miguel's unfinished story demanded resolution, and Alan was determined to find the truth. Hours of research finally led Alan to Iron Resolve, a Vietnam operation shrouded in secrecy. Miguel had died during the mission, credited with saving his unit, but whispers hinted at a failed intelligence retrieval. One name kept surfacing: Colonel Marcus Greaves. Greaves had commanded the mission and was rumored to have buried its true purpose. Alan found Greaves's address, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Steeling himself, he drove there and knocked on the door. After a long pause, it opened to reveal an older man with sharp, wary eyes. "Who are you?" Greaves asked, his tone curt. "I'm Alan. I need to know what happened to Miguel Santos and Iron Resolve." Greaves stiffened, his expression darkening. "Who sent you?" "No one. I think Miguel is trying to reach me." Greaves studied him carefully, then sighed. "Come in." The house was cluttered with military relics, medals, faded photos, and old maps. Greaves motioned for Alan to sit at the kitchen table, pouring himself a drink before sitting down across from him. "Iron Resolve wasn't reconnaissance," Greaves began, his voice heavy. It was a retrieval mission. We were sent to recover a dossier, highly classified intelligence, but someone betrayed us. The enemy was waiting. Alan's stomach tightened. What happened? We walked into an ambush. Most of us barely escaped. Miguel stayed behind to hold them off. Greaves's voice cracked slightly. He saved us, but the mission failed. The dossier was lost. That's why the mission, and Miguel's sacrifice, was buried. Alan leaned forward, gripping the letter in his pocket. What was in the dossier? Greaves shook his head. I don't know. Only the top brass knew, but Miguel thought it was worth dying for. He didn't hesitate. Silence filled the room, thick with tension. Alan struggled to process what he had learned. Miguel hadn't just been a hero to his unit. He had sacrificed himself for something far bigger. Do you think he's trying to finish what he started? Alan asked quietly. Greaves's eyes hardened. If Miguel's involved, you'd better be ready. Whatever he left undone, it won't stop until it's resolved. Miguel didn't give up easily. Neither should you. As Alan left, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't just sounds. They carried a sense of urgency that Alan couldn't ignore. Miguel hadn't just sacrificed himself for his unit. He had died for a secret that demanded to be uncovered. Alan clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He would see this through, no matter what it cost him. Alan couldn't escape the whispers. They followed him home, haunted his dreams, and filled his waking hours. Miguel's presence lingered, urging him toward action. But what action? The truth remained just out of reach. Alan's research revealed a critical location, the ambush site of Iron Resolve, deep in the Vietnamese jungle. It was there the dossier was lost, and perhaps the answers Miguel sought still remained. Though the thought of traveling across the world filled him with doubt, the whispers pushed him forward. Alan booked the flight knowing there was no turning back. Days later, he stood at the edge of a dense jungle. The air was thick and humid, the hum of insects constant. His guide, Bao, led him through overgrown paths, speaking little. Each step felt heavier as they approached the battlefield. "This is the place," Bao said, stopping abruptly. The clearing looked unremarkable, but Alan felt it. A heavy, oppressive energy. Scattered remnants of the past lay hidden among the undergrowth, rusted metal fragments and faint impressions of old foxholes. As Alan moved deeper into the clearing, the air shifted. The jungle grew silent. He turned to Bao, but his guide was gone. Panic welled in his chest as he stood alone. "Alan," a voice called softly. Spinning around, Alan froze. Miguel stood before him, his uniform torn and his face streaked with dirt and blood. Yet his presence felt powerful, commanding. "You came," Miguel said, his tone steady, "but this is only the beginning." Alan's voice trembled. "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" Miguel gestured to the ground. "The past doesn't stay buried. You must uncover the truth." Alan looked down and saw something glinting in the dirt. He dropped to his knees, brushing aside soil until he unearthed a rusted lockbox. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing yellowed papers inside. "What is this?" Alan whispered. "The truth," Miguel replied. "But it's not over." Suddenly, the jungle erupted with sound. Gunfire, shouting, and explosions surrounded him. Shadows of soldiers moved through the trees, their faces obscured but their pain palpable. Alan clutched the lockbox, his heart pounding as he relived the ambush. "Miguel!" he shouted, but the figure had vanished. The chaos swirled around him, growing unbearable until it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Alan found himself alone, the jungle eerily silent. Moments later, Bao reappeared, looking confused. "You okay?" he asked. Alan nodded, gripping the lockbox as if it were his lifeline. He followed Bao back to the trail, his mind racing. Whatever truth Miguel had left behind, It was now in Alan's hands, and he knew the journey was far from over. Alan couldn't open the documents during his flight home. The lockbox sat heavy in his lap, its contents a mystery that felt both urgent and overwhelming. Miguel's final words, "The truth, but it's not over," echoed in his mind. Back in his apartment, Alan opened the box, his hands trembling. Inside, he found yellowed papers, maps, and photographs. One photo showed a group of soldiers, Miguel at the center, his expression resolute. The back bore the phrase, "For the greater good." The notes detailed a secret dossier Miguel had protected, a file exposing a covert deal between high-ranking officials and foreign agents. The deal had cost countless lives. If exposed, it could have altered the war and toppled powerful figures. Miguel hadn't just been protecting intelligence, he had died for the truth. Alan felt the weight of Miguel's sacrifice more than ever. Among the documents was a map, marking a location in the U.S., a decommissioned military storage facility. Miguel had left a trail, and Alan knew he had to follow it. The next morning, Alan set out for the facility, the lockbox secured beside him. The journey gave him too much time to think. He replayed everything he had learned, Miguel's legacy, the truth buried with iron resolve, and his father's connection to it all. For the first time, Alan understood why Miguel had chosen him. He wasn't just a bystander, he was part of the story. When Alan arrived, the facility was abandoned, its gates rusted and overgrown. The map led him to a hidden bunker. Clearing debris from the entrance, Alan descended into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through stale air. The bunker was filled with rusted shelves and forgotten equipment, but his focus was on a locked cabinet marked on the map. The cabinet's brittle lock broke easily, revealing a scratched metal case. Alan opened it, his breath catching as he pulled out a file labeled "Confidential." Inside were documents matching Miguel's notes but with damning specifics. Names, dates, and signatures of those involved in the secret deal. It was undeniable proof of betrayal at the highest levels. As Alan packed the file, a sudden sound broke the silence. Footsteps echoing through the bunker. He froze, clutching the documents, his flashlight trembling. "Who's there?" he called, but no one answered. The whispers surged, louder and more urgent, as if warning him. Alan's instincts screamed at him to run. The past wasn't just alive, it was dangerous, and now it was coming for him. Alan's heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder, echoing through the bunker. His flashlight trembled in his hand. "Who's there?" he called, but the only answer was the deliberate approach of heavy boots. The whispers surged, frantic and urgent, urging him to run, but fear rooted him in place. From the shadows emerged an older man in a faded military jacket. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp. "You shouldn't be here," the man said coldly. "Who are you?" Alan asked, clutching the lockbox tighter. The man's gaze shifted to the box, his expression darkening. "That doesn't belong to you." Alan stood firm. It belonged to Miguel Santos. He died for this. At the name, the man's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're meddling with. Walk away now, before you get yourself killed." Alan's fear gave way to anger. "Miguel sacrificed everything for the truth. I'm not walking away." The man's face hardened. "The truth destroys more than just the guilty. It destroys everything." Before Alan could respond, the man drew a gun. "Give me the file." Alan's mind raced. "If Miguel thought this was worth dying for, I won't let you bury it." The man cocked the gun. "You think justice will come from this? All you'll bring is chaos." The whispers rose to a deafening pitch. The lights in the bunker flickered violently, plunging it into darkness. When they returned, Miguel stood between Alan and the man, his form shimmering but unmistakable. The man froze, his eyes wide. "No, that's impossible." Miguel's voice was steady, commanding. "You failed, Greaves. You betrayed your men and yourself. but it ends here." Alan's stomach dropped. "You're Colonel Greaves." Greaves took a step back, his hands shaking. "I didn't have a choice. You don't understand what they would have done." Miguel stepped closer, his presence almost tangible. "You always had a choice. The truth will be known." Alan found his courage. "He's right. People deserve to know what happened." Greaves's resolve crumbled. He lowered the gun, his shoulders slumping. "You have no idea what you're unleashing." Miguel turned to Alan, his expression softening. "You know what to do." Before Alan could respond, Miguel vanished. Greaves stared at the empty space, then at Alan. "If you go through with this, you'll make enemies you can't even imagine." Alan swallowed hard. Miguel didn't back down, and neither will I. Greaves shook his head and walked away, his footsteps echoing into silence. Alone in the bunker, Alan clutched the lockbox. The whispers had stilled, replaced by a deep calm. The truth was now his to carry, and to reveal, no matter the cost. Alan's world had narrowed to one goal, revealing the truth. The whispers were gone, replaced by silence that felt both heavy and expectant. Miguel had entrusted him with this burden, and Alan was determined to see it through. With the lockbox and its damning contents, he knew there was no turning back. At home, Alan spread the documents across his table. The photographs, maps, and reports painted a chilling picture of betrayal. Names of high-ranking officials leapt off the pages, men whose greed and lies had cost countless lives. This was the truth Miguel had died protecting. Now it was Alan's responsibility to decide what to do with it. Greaves's warning echoed in his mind. "You'll make enemies you can't even imagine." Doubt crept in, but Miguel's sacrifice pushed him forward. Alan picked up the phone and called Carla, an investigative journalist known for uncovering corruption. Though skeptical at first, she agreed to meet. The next morning, Alan handed over the lockbox in a quiet cafe. Carla flipped through the documents, her expression shifting from disbelief to shock. "This could ruin lives," she whispered. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Alan nodded firmly. "This isn't about me. It's about justice." Over the following weeks, Carla worked tirelessly to verify the documents and build a solid case. Alan kept a low profile, but he couldn't shake the weight of anticipation. When the exposé finally went public, the impact was immediate. The report detailed a secret military deal, exposing the betrayal Miguel had died to stop. Protests erupted, careers crumbled, and investigations reopened. Some of those implicated faced charges, while others went into hiding. Miguel's truth had finally seen the light. For Alan, life changed overnight. Reporters hounded him, and his name became synonymous with one of the greatest military scandals in history. Though he avoided the spotlight, he felt Miguel's presence, a quiet acknowledgement of a mission completed. One evening, as Alan watched news coverage of the fallout, the whispers returned. Not urgent, but calm. He turned to find Miguel standing there, his form faint but peaceful. "Thank you," Miguel said softly. "You've done what I couldn't." Alan's voice cracked. "You gave me the strength to do it." Miguel nodded, his expression serene. "The fight isn't over, but you've made it possible. That's enough." As Miguel faded, Alan felt a deep sense of closure. Miguel's sacrifice now had meaning, his legacy secure. The truth was no longer buried, and Alan had ensured the world would never forget it. Though the journey had been treacherous, he knew it had been worth it. Miguel's story and his courage would live on.